Hey there everybody, it's Alex here from VG247.com and I'm here with my review of Spider-Man for the PlayStation 4, or Marvel's Spider-Man as the full title of the game officially is. Now if you come here looking for scores and numbers, you come to the wrong place. We don't do that stuff, but I am going to talk about what I think of the game, how good it is, and how much I've enjoyed playing it, or not enjoyed playing it, over the course of the many hours I've spent with it. So I've spent a lot of time with this game over the last couple of weeks. We got it really early off Sony. They were really great about that, but that's really good because it let me get really deep into the open world of this game and really dive into what makes it special. And it is special. You know, I think this is probably the best superhero game for me since the first Batman Arkham game, since Arkham Asylum. I also think this game has some of the qualities that I sort of wanted out of Arkham City when that came about. Just in terms of being an open world superhero game that's set in a living, breathing city that isn't entirely taken over by supervillains. And I think that's really super cool. So let's start with the structure of the game, I guess. I think that's a gooder place to start as any. So it is an open world game, but it's an open world game that sort of transitions from world state to world state as the game proceeds. So when it starts out, you are sort of it's an everyday day in the life in Peter Parker, in Spider-Man. It's an older Peter Parker who's been through a lot, so he's already encountered a lot of his most iconic villains. He's already defeated them. Many of them are in the Raft, the big prison for supervillains. And this is a Peter who, for instance, has been with Mary Jane and broken up with her. And she's now working for the Daily Bugle and all that sort of stuff. And he's now working as a scientist, and there's some spoilery stuff in terms of that, so I won't talk anymore about Peter's day job. But anyway, so it's an older Spider-Man, but he's still quippy, he's still the same guy, but it does feel like there is a point behind. It feels different that they've given you an older, more experienced Spider-Man. In fact, the fact that this world is quite developed, I guess you would say. You know, there are supervillains that you encounter. There's one supervillain in particular that you encounter as part of a side quest who straight up says to you, you know, I fought the Avengers. Because in this world, the Avengers exist. Avengers Tower is there. You can climb Avengers Tower. In this world, a lot of that stuff has already taken place. And that's cool, I think. And it's a very different tone to sort of the Spider-Man games we've had before that were based off the Raimi movies where Spider-Man was, you know, a lone entity in that world. And indeed quite different to what we've had recently with the Marvel Cinematic Universe Spider-Man movies, where Peter is, of course, he's a young kid, and this Peter is not that. He's an experienced guy, and there's even scenes where, you know, he sort of mentors some other characters in a way, which is something you don't really tend to see from Peter Parker Spider-Man, at least in the audio-visual forms in which we've had him in the last couple of decades. So there's that. And like I say, that plays quite heavily into the structure of the game. So you are mostly out and about as Spider-Man, but from time to time you'll be required to sort of head back to Peter's day job. And when you get there, there are puzzle sequences where you're completing certain types of puzzles in order to progress the story, or in order to do them optionally to unlock additional points, which can then be spent in the upgrade system. And then the story just goes from mission to mission, and the main mission markers are the yellow markers that you get on the map, and if you go to those, you progress the story. But then as you swing around the city, you sort of encounter other things. So early on, the crimes will sort of be thug crimes. So literally crimes by drug dealers or muggers and stuff like that. So your Spidey sense them or hear them over the police radio which you're tuned into, and that'll put a waypoint on your map, and if you want you can swing over there and help. Later on, as the game progresses, things get more serious, and this is how they sort of tackle the Arkham City problem, where when they were making that game, Rocksteady said the problem with having people out in the city is, like normal people, is then you've got normal people and criminals and all that sort of stuff, and that's why they ended up coming to this design where Arkham City was a closed-off, giant, city-shaped prison, because then they can go nuts with whatever enemies want to do. In Spider-Man, without getting too spoilery, what happens is it starts out as a regular New York, And then gradually things get more messed up based on the things that are going on in the story. And so the thug crimes, for instance, give way to big-ass supernatural gang crimes where instead of fighting guys with crowbars and maybe one guy's got a handgun, you're suddenly fighting people with rocket launchers and assault rifles. And the situation then later on gets even worse still. And so the world changes, and with the changes to the world, you're still always in an open world, but it does mean, so when you reach the second world state, for instance, you can be swinging through the city and accidentally aggro some enemies and have some rocket launcher fire come your way, and there's nothing you can, then you've just got to either leg it, run away, that's a Britishism for run away, or you've got to stop and engage them, and sort of clear the streets of that problem. And I really, really like that structure, because it does feel like, it feels like right around the time that, and I was basically doing 100% of the side activities that were available before moving on, it felt like by the time I was starting to get bored of the world state, it would change. And with it changing also came a new slate of side activities and all that sort of stuff. And I will say also, as you progress from Act 1 to Act 2 to Act 3 of the game, I guess you would call it, you also have the old crimes don't disappear. So just because the gang crimes have appeared doesn't mean the thug crimes are gone and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, the combat is very, very similar to the alchemy sort of thing. So it's counters, gadgets, and sort of rhythmic-based melee. Obviously, the abilities of Spider-Man allow him to be a bit more agile, and you can do stuff like jump up and swing at any time to get away from people. If you need a breather, you could perhaps, and you're fighting on a rooftop, you could perhaps drop off the back of the rooftop, swing around, cling to the wall, and then when you feel like you're ready, climb back up and hop over. There's a multitude of Spidey suits that you can unlock, and they run the gamut from original ones for this game to ones that are sort of, I would say, tributes to famous ones, to ones that are straight up one-to-one versions of famous ones. Like, to throw one out there, for instance, or to throw two out there, for instance, they totally have the suit from Spider-Man Homecoming, and that has its own gadget, which is like, the little Spider-Man robot that comes off his chest in that movie, and that's in this as that suit's unique ability. And then they also have from Infinity War the Iron Spider suit that Stark gives Peter Parker in that movie, and that has, of course, the Iron Spider legs. But then also there are other ones. There's Punk Spider-Man. There's one that looks to me like it's inspired by the 90s animated series. So there's lots of different suits, and the suits all have slightly different abilities that affect not just combat, but also some stuff outside of combat. So the gameplay's good, the combat's good, and the world itself is good. And the story, just to briefly touch on the story without getting too into spoiler territory, I really, really like what they've done. It's definitely a post-Marvel Cinematic Universe story, so it follows some of the Marvel Cinematic Universe traditions, and there's definitely, for instance, post-credit sequences that tease where this Spider-Man universe could go in the future if they choose to carry on and perhaps do a sequel. But it's pretty interesting and unique. And one thing I will say is it takes a really interesting couple of twists away from what you might expect for Spider-Man fans who really know the series and really know the plot lines well. So that's really cool, I think. So I definitely really, really enjoy the way the story's executed. I think the characters are really well handled. In particular, I really, really like the relationship between MJ and Peter, where, as I said earlier on, they've had a relationship at this point, because this is an older Peter and an older MJ. They've had a relationship and broken up. And it's sort of the circumstances of the story, of the drama that's going on, that brings them back together. And it's clear Peter still wants to be with her. She's not sure, but she also needs him to help her uncover this story that she's working on. And there's some really interesting, fun interactions there. And they do some great stuff with text messages, where they sort of have that thing going on where, in the style popularised in recent years by Sherlock, text messages appear on the screen alongside while Spider-Man's reading the texts, and obviously Peter Parker always talks to himself too, and so you have these interesting moments where he's texting back and forth with MJ and he's in anguish about the state of their relationship, and he's talking to himself about that, but you're also reading the text on screen. And I really like the presentation and stuff of that, and there's a lot of little touches like that in the story. One thing I want to say about the story, actually, about the story sequences, is in that E3 demo they showed a couple of years ago, which is the villains escaping from the raft, I thought it looked a bit QTE, quick time event heavy, and the game itself isn't that QTE heavy. There are QTEs, but they come up on big moments, so don't think there's going to be a lot of that. For the most part, you are fully in control of everything that's going on with Spidey throughout the story. Well, not in cutscenes, but you know what I mean. It doesn't take control away from you as often as I feared from that demo. I guess if the game has any problem, it's just in the breadth of content available, and it's the sort of problem that most open world games suffer with to some degree, right? So a good example is how I said earlier that the game actually has multiple acts that sort of, and the state of the city changes. So early on, you're dealing with cleaning up the operation of Wilson Fisk, and one of the tasks there is to go to what they're called Fisk hideouts, I think, and you basically, there's a bunch of them scattered across the map, and they're basically challenges where you can take them out either in combat or stealth or a mix of the two. And they're usually construction sites, and it's like, okay, here's a construction site, there's 15 enemies around, but then when you defeat 10 of those 15, they'll call for backup. That causes a second wave of enemies to come in, and then there's 3 or 4 or 5 waves of enemies to take out. Fine, and they're good little side tasks, and you're given side missions within that to sort of do certain things, like, I don't know, do a certain number of counter attacks, or do a certain number of launcher attacks, or stick a certain number of enemies to the wall with your webs. And all that earns you upgrade stuff that can be poured into gadgets and suits and stuff like that. Fine. Now when you get to the second, sort of the Act 2 of the game, you're then dealing with some enemies called the Demons, and lo and behold, there are a bunch of demon hideouts. Now these are indoors, so they're not part of the open world. You have to find the entrance to them in the open world and enter them. But broadly speaking, they're the same sorts of challenges. Another good example is there's side missions where, say, you have to defuse a bomb, and then there's a bunch more side missions where you have to defuse a bomb in the same way. The crimes, the thug crimes, they split into multiple districts. The city split into multiple districts, that is to say, and the crimes are sort of like, okay, you go here, and there's a car run amok. You've got to stop the car in Harlem, but then down in the financial district, you've also got a car stopping mission. There's a mugging, there's a shop robbery going on in I don't know, the Upper East Side, and then there's also one of those going on up in Harlem, and so on and so forth. So there's a duplication of content that of course you get in an open world. Nothing is duplicated massively, but that's just something to keep in mind. It's like, I always think it's important to bring some criticisms to the table when you're doing a review like this, and that is my main one of this, except for this one. Bloody stealth sequences. So, without going into too much detail, there are sequences in this game where you play as characters who are not Spider-Man and not Peter Parker, i.e. characters who don't have the abilities. They do have some small abilities of their own that you can use, but all these sequences, more or less, are all about sneaking past guards and sneaking past drones, and bloody hell, like, they're not particularly difficult, it's just frustrating. I think any time that a game puts in a stealth mission where if somebody sees you, that's it, it's game over, back to a checkpoint, it's bullshit. Like, this game is really generous, all the same, I want to note, like, really generous in terms of, on those missions, they know those missions, they clearly know, Insomniac clearly know that those missions are a bit of a problem, because the checkpointing is really aggressive. So say it's a 5-minute stealth sequence, there's usually a checkpoint every 30 seconds on that sort of thing. So every single move you make, if you move from box A to box B and pass one guard, as soon as you hit box B, that tends to be a checkpoint. And that's fair enough. I get why they've done it that way, because if it sent you all the way back to the start, oh my god, I'd be complaining so much louder. But it's still, those stealth sequences still aren't hugely enjoyable. There's some twists on some of those later on. There's a great one where you are playing a stealth sequence as a normal character while Spider-Man's already in the room, and you're sort of then calling out enemy positions to Spider-Man so he can take them out. And that feels good, because obviously rather than just sneaking past them and being completely helpless, you are actually trying to sneak up on them, get close enough to call them out to Spidey, who then webs them up. but the others aren't so good. So that's my main criticism. But it's just, like I say, the best superhero game since Arkham Asylum for my money. And it's just how good everything feels. It's how good and snappy that combat feels, and how early on that combat can feel a bit frustrating, just in terms of the depth of what you have available to you. But as you unlock the gadgets, you can do some mean combos of things, and you can really, to hit on the cliche, it makes you feel like Spider-Man, because you're like, okay, I'm gonna, there's 10 enemies here in a big group. I'm gonna toss in this web bomb that webs some of them up so they can't attack. Then I'm gonna use the impact web to fire one back into the wall. Then I'm gonna use this sort of air blast to knock a bunch of them over. Then I'm going to take out the big guy. You can plan ahead, you can plan on the fly. Some of the upgrades make the counter window a little bit larger. Some of them give you more options after counters. And all this stuff really adds up to make for a really fun, really interesting combat experience. And it says a lot that I've played many, many, many hours of this game, and I'm still not bored of the combat. I'm still finding new ways to tackle it, and still finding new ways to take down some of the harder enemies who aren't just, who you can't just kill with brute force. Well, not kill, because Spider-Man doesn't kill, apart from the fact that you knock loads of people off really tall buildings in this game. It's that classic sort of superhero thing where in cutscenes Spider-Man is always pulling people up and out and webbing them so they can't fall, and then when you are in normal combat, one of the easiest ways to get rid of enemies is to use the impact web, or just use a launcher to send them flying off a roof and 30 floors down. But of course they don't die. Spider-Man doesn't kill people. So yeah, the combat's really good, and of course it wouldn't be right if I didn't take a second to just talk about the swinging. So I don't know what to say other than it feels amazing. Obviously, anybody who's of a certain age has really fond memories of Spider-Man 2 on the original Xbox, PlayStation 2 and GameCube, which is the movie tie-in game. And famously, as was recently reported on US Gamer, the thing about that game was they didn't know what they were really making, because they didn't know anything about the movie until quite late on, and so they spent most of their development time perfecting movement. And that's why in that game the web slinging and swinging between buildings and traversal felt so good. Now, in this game, it feels even better. It feels really organic. There's lots of stuff you can do, so if you get close to a building, you can run along it instead of swing next to it. There's sort of some moves you can unlock through the skill tree, or just perfect as you get better at the game, which will allow you to gain momentum. Put it this way, there's a mission in the game, there's a side mission, where it actually takes away your ability to swing from buildings, and then challenges you to get across the city quickly. And there are so many different options for traversal where, even if you're not swinging, by using your webs to launch yourself towards things and then catapulting yourself off things and all that sort of stuff, you can have this really, really satisfying, brilliant time just rolling around like a nutcase, just swinging through the city. Now, this game does introduce a fast travel later on, and there's sort of, I didn't mention earlier, but there's towers you can unlock around the map to reveal the map, and then there are challenge stations around the map, and both of those can be fast traveled to. But I didn't start to fast travel until the very, 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 very end of the game, when there was pretty much nothing else going on in the city because I'd completed everything. Because swinging was so fun. It was like enduring the load screen for 10 seconds was actually more of a pain than spending 30 seconds swinging through the city, because you can get such velocity up and it feels so good. Yeah, I really, really like it. Last and certainly least, I just want to address this bloody puddle downgrade controversy. I don't know if it has been downgraded or if puddles have been removed, but all I can tell you is this game looks really, really good. Looks absolutely gorgeous, absolutely beautiful. Really seems to be pushing the PS4. All this footage is from a PS4 Pro for what it's worth, but I think it looks fabulous. There's a little bit of texture popping, so if a character appears in a real-time cutscene, you may notice they've got lower res textures at first, and then they pop in that sort of classic Mass Effect 1 way. But other than that, it's a really fabulous looking game, and I've really got no problem with it whatsoever. So yeah, that is Spider-Man for the PlayStation 4. I think this is exactly the sort of exclusive game that was needed for the end of the year. I'm sure it's going to do absolutely fabulously through the holiday because it is a really, really fun game. And I just, open world can be hard to make work sometimes, but I think if there's any character that sort of fits it, it's Spider-Man. I'm not sure you wouldn't make a Captain America game like this. And even, I would say, there's an argument for it perhaps didn't suit Batman as much as being in an enclosed space did, which is why I think Asylum is better than City and Night and Origins. But Spider-Man is the one for this sort of game, and the best possible thing I can say is I've played this game to death. I've done very little else over the review period because there's a lot to see of it, and I'm still not really entirely bored of it, and I'm quite tempted to do some New Game Plus stuff, and I'm quite tempted to just tool around in the open world some more, and I'm really, really hopeful that this leads to a sequel, or perhaps, I don't know, I'm really interested what will happen, because obviously Square Enix is doing that Avengers game, but I wonder how the Marvel license fits, because, in Insomniac, you could see them doing a hell of a Spider-Man sequel, but you could also see them doing an Iron Man game or something like that with a very different tone. And after seeing how good this is, I'd be up for any of it. So yeah, that's Marvel's Spider-Man. I really, really do recommend it. If you like superheroes, if you like open world games, if you just like fun, colourful, snappy games with great combat, this is well worth your time. So yeah, don't forget that if you want to read a review, you can read it on VG247.com. Don't forget to give us a like and a subscribe. That sort of stuff really helps us prove to our bosses that all this is worthwhile. And yeah, so that's Spider-Man. Highly recommended. Until next time, everyone. See ya.